The Wyoming wind was a constant thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, the heat from your bones, and the hope from your heart, leaving behind nothing but cracked earth and brittle silence. Clara Carter drove the post-hole digger into the ground with a grunt, the impact jarring her to the shoulder. The wood of the old fence post beside her was silvered and splintered. She was mending the southern line, the one that bordered the Harrison Ranch, though the Harrisons themselves were long gone. Starved out 2 winters back, now, their land belonged to a cattle syndicate from Cheyenne, a faceless entity that owned everything as far as she could see, everything except her patch, the Box C. It was arid land, most of it, but it had the one thing the syndicate coveted, the Sweetwater Creek, a thin ribbon of life that cut through her western pasture, keeping it stubbornly green even in the worst of the drought. She was 29 years old, though the sun and the grief had etched lines around her eyes that belonged to a woman of 40. She worked alone. She had buried her father, Silas, near that same creek. She had buried her fiancé, Thomas, on the hill overlooking it. She trusted the land because it was honest. It demanded everything from you, and in return, it gave you just enough to see the next sunrise. Men were different. Men lied. She saw the dust cloud rising from the east long before the buggy crested the ridge. She gripped the digger handle, her knuckles white. She didn't need to see the slick black paint to know who it was. Mr. Ames, from the railroad, pulled his horse to a stop, careful to stay on the road and not her property. He tipped his bowler hat, a gesture that seemed obscene in this wilderness. "Miss Carter, a fine, hot afternoon." Clara drove the digger into the earth again. "I'm busy. Mr. Ames." Ames produced a white handkerchief and dabbed his upper lip. He was a soft man, built for offices and smoke-filled rooms. "The Union Pacific is prepared to increase its offer significantly. $500. Miss Carter, for this barren stretch. A veritable fortune. Enough to see you to Cheyenne, perhaps even back east. A new start." She stopped, pulling the heavy tool from the ground. She leaned on it, her sweat-soaked shirt sticking to her back. "My answer is the same as it was last month, and the month before that. Be reasonable." He sighed, his patience thinning. "We are coming through, with or without your cooperation. This patch of dirt is holding up progress. It's holding up the future. This patch of dirt holds my father," she said, her voice low and flat. "His blood paid for it when the raiders came. Thomas's blood paid for it when the Harrisons disputed the line. I'm not selling. You are one woman, and I am still here." Ames's smile was gone. He looked at her, his eyes cold. "That can be rectified, Miss Carter." Accidents happen in this territory. Fires, lost stock. It would be a tragedy for you to lose what little you have left for simple stubbornness. He did not wait for a reply. He snapped the reins, the buggy lurching in a turn and rattling back toward the faint smudge of civilization they called a town. Clara watched him go, her heart a cold knot. It was another warning. They were getting bolder. She was running out of time. She turned back to the fence post, her jaw set. She would not be moved. He arrived 3 days later, not with the arrogance of a railroad man, but with the quiet drift of a tumbleweed. He rode a dust-colored buckskin, a good horse, which told her he was either lucky or capable. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a stillness about him that set her teeth on edge. He wore his hat low, but she could see the dark stubble on his jaw and the weary lines around his mouth. He looked like he had seen too much and said too little. He stopped 20 feet from where she was watering her mare. "Daisy, at the trough." "Ma'am." His voice was rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. She did not turn, but kept her hand on Daisy's neck. "I'm not hiring, and I don't feed drifters. I'm not looking for a handout, just work." She finally looked at him. His eyes were gray, shadowed by the brim of his hat. They were steady. Too steady. Smooth-talking men she could handle. She knew the shape of their lies. Silent men were dangerous. They kept their secrets locked deep. "What kind of work?" "Whatever you've got. Fencing, breaking horses, clearing rock. I'm capable. She saw his hands on the reins. They were scarred, calloused, strong. He wasn't lying about that. She was tired. The threats from Ames, the endless work, the nights spent sleeping with her father's Winchester beside the bed, it was wearing her down to the bone. She needed help. She hated needing it. $10 a month, board in the barn. You eat what I eat. You start now. He nodded once. Fair enough. What name do you go by? Jack McCrae. Unclasp your gun belt. Mr. McCrae, leave it on your saddle horn. You work for me. You don't wear a weapon on my land. A flicker of something, surprise, maybe respect, passed through his eyes. He did as she asked. His movements economical and precise. He unbuckled the heavy belt and hung it on the horn. Barn's over there, she said, pointing. There's a stack of split rails needs moving to the north pasture before dark. He just nodded again, tipped his hat, and rode the buckskin toward the barn. Clara watched him go, her stomach tight. She had just invited the wolf into the fold, but she didn't know if he was there to protect the sheep or to eat them. Their first days were brittle with silence. Clara was suspicious of everything he did. She watched how he handled her horses, expecting roughness, but saw only a firm, quiet competence. She watched him mend the harness, his stitches small and even. He worked from sunup to sundown, never complaining about the meager meals of beans and biscuits, never asking questions. He was too capable. Drifters were usually broken, desperate, or loud. Jack McCrae was none of those things. He was a closed door. The tension between them was as thick as the dust. She gave him orders. He followed them, but she felt his eyes on her when she worked. A silent observation that felt like a judgment. He was measuring her, just as she was measuring him. The third night, the sky turned a sickly green-gray. The wind, usually a steady push, fell utterly still. Storm's coming, Jack said, standing in the barn doorway as she finished milking the cow. A bad one. I've seen bad ones. She stood, the pail heavy in her hand. Not like this. We should get the horses into the barn, and that calf in the east pasture. She bristled at the we, but she knew he was right. The air was electric, pressing down on them. They worked quickly, the sky darkening from gray to a deep, bruised purple. They herded the nervous horses into their stalls just as the first drops of rain, thick and cold, began to fall. It was not a normal storm. It was a deluge. The wind shrieked, hitting the small cabin like a fist. Rain turned to sleet, then to stinging hail that hammered the roof shingles. Clara stood at the window, watching her world disappear into a white, roaring chaos. The barn roof, Jack said, appearing beside her. She hadn't heard him enter the cabin. That patch I was mending, it won't hold against this. It'll have to. It'll tear off. We'll lose the roof. The horses will panic and break their legs. He was already pulling on his heavy coat. He grabbed a coil of rope from the porch. What are you doing? You'll be killed out there. Maybe, but that roof is going. Stay inside. Keep the door barred. He was gone before she could argue, disappearing into the blinding sleet. She ran to the window, her heart pounding a sick rhythm. She could see nothing. She was alone again. The storm, a living thing trying to tear her home apart. The sound of the wind was a scream. It was the same sound she remembered from that night, 5 years ago. The memory hit her like the hail, sharp and cold. She wasn't in her cabin. She was in the root cellar, her father's hand over her mouth. Silas. He had pushed her down into the dark, earthy smell of potatoes and dust. Don't make a sound. Clara, no matter what. She had heard the horses, the yelling, the splintering of her mother's china cabinet, then the gunshots, 3 of them, sharp and final. She had waited until the sun came up. She found him by the water trough. The raiders had taken the horses and the food, but they had left him, a warning to any other settlers. He had been wrong. This land hadn't just demanded work. It had demanded blood. A loud crack from outside snapped her back to the present. The storm raged. McCrae had been out there for nearly an hour. She paced the small cabin, the fire roaring in the hearth. fighting the walls that seemed to be closing in. 2 years after her father, it was Thomas. Thomas, who was kind and spoke of building a real house, with glass windows. He'd ridden out to meet the Harrisons about the creek. They claimed he'd pulled a gun, but Thomas didn't own a gun. They found him on the boundary line, shot in the back. She had buried him herself. That winter was the worst. The snows came in October and did not stop. She was snowed in, alone, from December to March. The last of her cattle froze, standing upright in the fields. She ran out of flour, then beans. She boiled the leather from her father's boots to make a thin, greasy soup. She had been so cold. For so long, she had forgotten what warmth felt like. She had survived, but the woman who came out of that cabin in the spring was someone else. Someone harder. Someone who knew that trust was a luxury, and love was a ghost. The cabin door burst open, slamming against the wall. Jack McCrae fell inside, a blast of ice and wind following him. He was covered in it, his coat frozen solid, his face pale and raw. He managed to shove the door closed and drop the bar. "The roof," she whispered. "It held." He was breathing hard, shivering violently. He leaned against the door, pulling off his frozen gloves. His fingers were white. She grabbed the whiskey bottle from the shelf and a tin cup. She poured him a heavy dose. "Here." He took it, his hand shaking so badly he needed two to hold the cup. He drank it down in one swallow, coughing as the liquid fire hit his stomach. "You're a fool," she said, her voice rough. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark in the firelight. "Maybe, but the horses are safe." She didn't know what to say. He had risked his life. For her roof, for her horses. She grabbed a quilt from her cot. "Get those wet things off. Get by the fire." He stripped off the frozen coat and his wet shirt, his back to her. She saw a map of old scars on his skin, white and puckered. He was no stranger to violence. He sat on the hearth, wrapped in the quilt, shivering. She made coffee, her hands unsteady. They sat in silence for a long time, the storm screaming outside, the fire crackling within. The storm lasted 2 days. They were trapped. The tension was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer just suspicion. It was awareness. On the second day, her favorite mare, Daisy, the one she'd had since she was a girl, managed to get her leg tangled in some wire that had blown into the barn. When Clara found her, the mare was panicked, pulling against the wire, a deep gash in her foreleg bleeding heavily. "No!" Clara cried, a raw sound of despair. She couldn't lose Daisy. She couldn't lose anything else. She tried to cut the wire, but the horse thrashed, wild-eyed. "Hold her steady," Jack's voice, calm and low, cut through her panic. He was there, holding a small leather roll. "Hold her head. Talk to her." Clara did, burying her face in the mare's neck, whispering, her tears wetting the horse's coat. Jack worked quickly. He cut the wire, then gently, firmly. He examined the wound. "It's deep, needs stitches." He cleaned it with whiskey from his own flask, the horse shuddering but holding still for his touch. Clara watched his hands. They were rough, scarred, but they were unbelievably gentle. He took a needle and thread from his kit and began to sew the wound, his movements precise and economical. He saved her horse. That night, the storm had passed, leaving an eerie, frozen silence. Clara watched him from the cabin door as he checked the stitches one last time. He hadn't asked for thanks. He hadn't said a word about the roof or the horse. She felt a crack in the ice around her heart, a dangerous, painful crack. Jack was quiet, but he saw everything. He saw the way she checked the locks on her door twice. He saw the worn handle of the Winchester she kept leaning against the wall. He saw the exhaustion she tried to hide. He respected her. He had been sent by the syndicate. His job was simple: get the lay of the land, find the woman's weakness, and report back. The $500 Ames offered was a joke. The syndicate would pay him twice that just for a map of her water sources and defenses. But the woman he'd been told about, a stubborn, foolish spinster, was not the woman he found. He found a survivor. He saw her sadness when she thought he wasn't looking, a profound loneliness that matched his own. He found himself hiding the map in the bottom of his saddlebag, pushing his guilt down. He was a man with a violent past, trying to earn enough to disappear. But this job was beginning to taste like ash. A week passed. The thaw came. The fragile trust built during the storm held. They worked the ranch, repairing the damage. The silence between them was less tense, almost comfortable, until the night she found the map. She had gone to the barn to get salve for her hands. She heard a rustling from the tack room, where he slept. She froze, her hand going to the pistol she now kept at her waist. She pushed the door open quietly. Jack McCrae was not sleeping. He was hunched over an empty feed barrel, a lantern beside him. Spread out on the wood was a piece of parchment. It was a hand-drawn map of her land, her creek, her pastures, her cabin, all marked. And in the corner, notations about water depth and grazing capacity. The blood drained from her face, leaving a cold, sharp fury. "What is that?" he started, turning, his hand instinctively moving to cover the map. But it was too late. "Clara, you're one of them." It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. He was Ames. He was the syndicate. He was every man who had ever lied to her, tried to take from her. She pulled the Winchester from the hooks by the barn door where she'd left it. She aimed it at his chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back was deafening in the small space. "All this time?" she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "Helping, the roof, the horse. It was all a lie." "It wasn't," he said, his voice low. He raised his hand slowly, away from the map. "Clara, put the rifle down. Get your things. Get off my land, or I will bury you on it. Just listen to me. I'm done listening to liars," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She took a step forward, her finger tightening on the trigger. He moved. He was faster than she could have imagined. He didn't go for his own gun, still hanging on his saddle. He moved toward her. He seized the rifle barrel, pushing it toward the ceiling. The shot exploded, deafening them, splintering the rafters. Before she could react, his other hand was on hers, prying her fingers from the stock. He twisted the rifle from her grasp and threw it onto a pile of hay. He backed her against the rough wood of the barn wall, his body caging hers. She was trapped, her hands pinned by her sides. She was breathing hard, trembling, glaring at him with pure hatred. "You want my land," she hissed. The words spat like venom. He was close, so close she could feel the heat coming off him, see the dark flecks in his gray eyes. His gaze was burning, but not with violence. It was something else, something she hadn't seen in years. He leaned in, his mouth just inches from hers. "And your heart," he whispered. The air left her lungs. The fury was still there, a hot, roaring fire. But under it, something else flickered, a terrifying, confusing warmth. Her body was pressed against his, all hard muscle and unyielding strength. She hadn't been touched by a man in so long. She hated him for it. She hated him for making her feel anything but rage. She trembled, her eyes wide, caught between the urge to knee him and the shocking, traitorous desire to believe him. The moment stretched, thick and heavy as molasses. The smell of gunpowder, hay, and his skin filled her senses. Then it broke. She shoved him, using all her strength. "Get out." He didn't resist. He stepped back, letting her go. His face was a mask she couldn't read. Clara snatched her rifle from the hay. She didn't trust herself to look at him again. She turned and fled the barn, her boots stumbling on the uneven ground. She didn't stop until she was inside her cabin, the door barred, the Winchester shaking in her hands. In the barn, Jack McCrae stood alone. He slowly rolled up the map. He had come here for the land. He had found something far more dangerous. He let her go. She did not sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, her father's Winchester laid across her knees, and watched the sliver of gray light grow at the window. The cabin was cold. The fire had died to embers. When the sun was high enough to cast a weak light into the room, she stood, her body stiff. She unbarred the door. The air outside was sharp, carrying a stillness that felt wrong. He was already in the barn, saddling his buckskin. His meager belongings were rolled in his blanket, tied behind the cantle. He heard her boots on the hard-packed earth and turned. His face was grim, his gray eyes shadowed. He had expected her. "You have until this shadow touches the trough," she said, her voice flat. She pointed to the long, thin line cast by the corner of the barn. "Then I don't care where you go, but you'll be off my land." He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply checked the cinch on his saddle, his movements deliberate. That silent acceptance angered her more than any protest would have. "You're a snake, Jack McCrae," she said, needing to give the wound a voice. "You came here lying, and you stayed here lying. You ate my food, you fixed my roof, you saved my horse, all for a map." He stopped, his hand on the saddle horn. He looked at her, and for a moment, she saw the man from the night before, the one whose eyes had burned with something other than greed. "Clara, it's not that simple." "It is," she insisted, her grip tightening on the rifle. "You get on that horse and you ride. Tell your syndicate employers they'll get this land when I'm in the ground. Not a day sooner." He turned back to the horse. He was leaving. A gust of wind hit the barn, rattling the door on its leather hinges. It was a cold wind, biting, and it carried a new smell. Not dust, not pine, iron. Jack stopped his work. He lifted his head, sniffing the air. He walked to the barn door and looked north, past the cabin, toward the Laramie Peak. The sky, which had been a clear, pale gray, was now a roiling mass of bruised purple. It was moving fast. "You might want to hold off on that ultimatum, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. "I want you gone." "You won't in an hour." He pointed. "That's not a squall. That's a blizzard." Clara stepped out, her eyes following his. He was right. The clouds were not riding high. They were low, heavy and churning. Even as she watched, the temperature dropped, the wind moaned, a low, rising howl. The first flakes, hard and small as sand, began to sting her face. "It'll pass," she said, her voice tight with denial. "It won't," Jack said. He was already unsaddling his horse. "It's settling in. We're in for it." She looked at the shadow of the barn. It had barely moved. "Get out, McCrae. I mean it." "You can shoot me," he said, turning to face her fully, the wind whipping his hair. "Or you can let me help you get the livestock under cover before they freeze." "That cow of yours won't last 2 hours in this." She hated him. She hated that he was right. She hated that the world was conspiring to keep this liar on her land. "The cow," she said, her teeth clenched. "Then the woodpile. Then you can take shelter in the barn. But you do not come in the cabin." Fair enough. The snow did not fall gently. It came sideways, a horizontal wall of white that erased the world in minutes. They worked in a blinding chaos, the wind screaming so loudly they could not speak. They herded the nervous milk cow and her calf into the barn, their hides already coated in ice. They fought the horses into their stalls. Clara worked on pure, hot rage. Jack worked with a grim efficiency. He moved to the woodpile, his back to the wind, and began splitting logs with a desperate speed. Clara grabbed the canvas tarp from the wagon and began hauling the wood onto the porch, stacking it high. They worked until their fingers were numb and their faces raw. By noon, the world was gone. The snow was a foot deep and rising. The cabin was an island in a roaring ocean of white. Clara slammed the cabin door, dropping the heavy bar into place. She was shaking, not just from cold. She leaned against the door, breathing hard. He was out there, in the barn. She had left him in the barn. She lit the lantern, the cabin sinking into a gloomy twilight. She built up the fire, the wood hissing as the ice on it melted. She made coffee, her hands trembling. She had told him to stay in the barn. The barn was sturdy. He had food in his saddlebags. He was a survivor. He would be fine. The wind shrieked, a sound like a woman grieving. She paced the small room. The barn was sturdy, but it was not warm. He had saved her horses. He had saved her roof. She cursed, the word sharp in the small space. She pulled her coat back on, grabbed the lantern, and unbarred the door. It took all her strength to open it against the wind. The snow was already halfway up her knees. She couldn't see the barn, a building that stood only 50 feet away. She followed the guide rope she had strung for this very reason, her hand burning as it gripped the frozen hemp. She found him in the tack room, huddled in his blanket, his back against the wall. He was shivering. "Get inside," she yelled over the storm. He looked up, his face pale. "I'm fine. Don't be a damn fool. You'll be dead by morning. Get inside the cabin, that's an order." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he rose, grabbing his saddlebags. He followed her back, a shadow in the white chaos. The cabin, which had always felt like her fortress, suddenly felt like a cage. It was one room, barely 12 by 16 feet. Her cot was in one corner, the hearth and table in the center, her dry sink and supplies in the other. There was nowhere to hide. He dropped his saddlebags by the door, took off his frozen coat, and stood near the hearth, soaking up the heat, saying nothing. "You sleep there," she said, pointing to the floor by the fire. "Don't talk to me, don't look at me. Just stay alive until this passes." He nodded, sinking to the floor, holding his numb hands out to the flames. The blizzard lasted for 4 days. The tension was a living thing. It was in the air they breathed. Every sound was magnified. The pop of the fire, the scrape of a spoon in a pot, the rustle of his blanket when he shifted. Clara kept to her cot, mending clothes, her back to him. Jack kept to the hearth. He read a worn copy of a book he'd pulled from his bags, or he simply stared into the fire. But the cabin demanded work. The storm was relentless. Snow piled against the door, needing to be shoveled away from the inside, a few feet at a time, to keep them from being buried. The wind found every crack. On the second day, Clara woke to the smell of coffee. He had risen before her, quietly, and made a pot. He had also, she saw, repaired the broken latch on the wood box. She said nothing. She poured a cup, her back to him. "The window shutter's loose," he said to the fire. "It's letting in a draft. I can fix it, if you've got a hammer and nails." She was so tired. The rage that had fueled her was guttering, leaving a bone-deep weariness. She was exhausted from the hate. "In the chest," she said, her voice rough with sleep. He fixed the shutter. The cabin was noticeably warmer. That afternoon, she was checking her dwindling supply of flour. He spoke again. "I can cook, if you'd like." She looked at him. He was not looking at her, but at the sack of beans. "What do you know about cooking?" "I know it's better than raw flour. I can make biscuits, even in that skillet." She hesitated. Then she nodded, pushing the flour sack toward him with her foot. He cooked. He made biscuits and bacon, and the cabin filled with a smell that reminded her of mornings before her father died. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the room. It was the best food she'd had in a year. The simple, domestic acts were more disarming than any violence. He was not the monster she had painted him. He was quiet. He was capable. He was, she was forced to admit, respectful. He never crossed the invisible line she had drawn down the center of the cabin. He slept on the hard floor without complaint. He pulled his weight. On the third night, the storm reached its peak. The wind did not howl. It screamed. The cabin groaned, the logs shifting under the weight of the snow and the force of the wind. Clara, unable to sleep, sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester back on her lap. She was terrified. Not of him, of the storm. It was trying to take her. "It'll hold," Jack said from the darkness by the fire. She started. She thought he was asleep. "You don't know that." "The man who built this cabin knew his business. These logs are saddle-notched. The foundation is solid. It'll hold." She rocked, the creak of the chair barely audible. "You know about building. I know about staying alive." They fell silent again, but the silence had changed. It was shared. On the fourth day, the wind finally died. The silence it left behind was absolute, heavy. The world was buried. The snow was piled to the eaves of the cabin. Clara felt a wave of despair so profound it buckled her knees. She was trapped. All her work, undone. Her cattle, dead. Her fences, buried. She sank onto her cot and put her face in her hands. It was all too much. She couldn't fight anymore. She didn't mean to cry. She made no sound, but a tear slipped. Then another. She fumbled in the small crate beside her bed for a handkerchief. Her hand brushed against a small, velvet-covered box. She pulled it out. She hadn't opened it in months. She was so tired. She opened the lid. It was a faded tintype photograph. A young, smiling man in a borrowed suit, Thomas. Beside him, a younger Clara, holding a small bundle wrapped in a white blanket. She traced the face of the man. Then her finger moved to the tiny, wrinkled face of the baby. Her son, Samuel. He had lived for 6 weeks. He and Thomas had been taken by the same fever, within a day of each other. That was 2 years ago, before the starvation winter. She had buried her father, then her fiancé, then her child. The land had taken everything. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, scrubbing her face. Jack was standing there. He hadn't made a sound. His face was unreadable. His gray eyes fixed on the photograph in her hands. She snapped the box shut. "Go away. Leave me be." He didn't move. He just looked at her. His gaze filled with a sorrow so deep it mirrored her own. "I had a son," she whispered, the words tearing out of her. "His name was Samuel. He was so small. The fever took him. Then it took Thomas. I buried them both on the hill, in the frozen ground. I couldn't even dig proper." She was sobbing now, the ugly, dry sounds of grief that had been locked away for too long. Jack did not pry. He did not offer empty comforts. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and looked at his own scarred hands. "I worked as a hired gun," he said, his voice flat, "for a cattle baron down in Texas, a man like the ones you're fighting now. We were sent to clear squatters off a piece of land he wanted. He said they were thieves." Clara's sobs quieted. She listened. "We rode in at dawn. They weren't thieves. It was a family. A man, his wife, 2 little girls. They had built a sod house, planted corn." He paused, swallowing. "The baron's foreman didn't give them a chance. He said it was an example. I watched them. I watched them burn the house. I watched them slaughter that family. The little girls." He closed his eyes. "I shot the foreman. Then I shot the 2 other men I'd ridden with. I've been running ever since. The baron has a long memory, and a lot of money. The syndicate, they offered me a way out, a new start. All I had to do was get a map of your land." He looked at her. "I saw a family slaughtered for a patch of dirt. I won't be part of that again." They sat in the quiet, buried cabin. 2 broken people, their secrets laid bare. That night, the fire was the only source of heat. The cold was a physical, pressing weight. Clara shivered on her cot, buried under 2 quilts. Jack was on the floor, his own blanket clearly not enough. She could hear his teeth chattering in the darkness. She lay there for an hour, listening to the cabin settle, listening to him shiver. "McCrae." Her voice was a whisper. "Ma'am, you're going to freeze." A silence. "I'm fine. Stop lying. Get your blanket. You can sleep on top of the quilts. On the cot, but if you touch me, I will use the pistol I keep under my pillow." She heard him hesitate. Then, the sound of him rising. He moved to her cot. He did not get under the quilts. He lay on top, a rigid line of muscle, his own blanket wrapped tight around him. The cot was small. They were shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. The cold from his body seeped into her quilts. An hour passed. She was still cold. He was still shivering. "This is foolish," she whispered, her voice rough with shame. "Get under the quilts, but stay on your side." He shifted, sliding under the layers. The cold he brought with him made her gasp, but then his body began to warm. He lay still as stone, his back to her. She lay awake, her own body rigid, slowly. The warmth from his back began to seep into her. It had been years since she had felt another person's warmth. She was so tired of being alone. In the middle of the night, her defenses broken by sleep and sorrow. She turned. "Jack!" He tensed, "Ma'am." "Hold me," she whispered, the words costing her everything. "Just hold me. I'm so cold." He hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was warm. He was solid. He tucked his chin, his breath warming the top of her head. He said nothing. He just held her. Clara wept, silently this time, and for the first time in years. She slept without the rifle. When she woke, the cabin was bright. Sunlight was streaming through the snow-caked window. She was tangled with him. Her leg was thrown over his, her head on his chest. His arms were wrapped tightly around her. It was the safest she had felt since her father was alive. Shame hit her like a bucket of ice water. She recoiled, scrambling off the cot, pulling the quilt with her. She hit the cold floor and backed away. Jack woke instantly, his eyes clear. He saw her face, the shame and fear, and he did not move. He did not speak. He just watched her, watched. "The storm's broken," she said, her voice harsh. She pointed to the door. "We have to dig out." He let her go without a word. He got up, pulled on his boots, and grabbed the shovel. It took them a full day to dig a tunnel out of the cabin. The world was a brilliant, blinding white. The snow was 5 feet deep, drifted higher against the barn. They found 2 of her cattle frozen in the field. The rest were huddled in the barn, cold and hungry, but alive. They worked. They did not talk about the night on the cot. They did not talk about their secrets. They shoveled snow. They fed the stock. They reset the fences they could find. A new partnership formed, born of shared survival. He was no longer her prisoner, or her employee. He was just Jack. She was just Clara. She began to see him as a man trying to start over, just like her. He was right. He wasn't a threat. He was just as broken as she was. Their dynamic deepened. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown. The land, recovering from the snow, demanded everything. "No, not like that," she said, stopping him as he was stretching wire. "You'll leave it too loose. It has to be tight enough to sing when you pluck it, or the cattle will just push it over." She showed him how to use the wire stretcher, her hands over his, guiding him. "You brace your weight, like this, then you staple it hard." He learned. He was a fast learner. Later that week, they were checking the perimeter. She still carried her rifle. "You're good with that," he said, nodding to the Winchester. "I can hit a rabbit at 50 yards, but can you hit it while it's running? And can you reload before it's gone?" He took the rifle from her. He set up 3 tin cans on a log, 100 yards away. "You aim low," he said, his voice dropping into a teacher's cadence. "You squeeze the trigger, don't pull it, and you breathe out." He showed her how to work the lever action without taking the rifle from her shoulder, how to keep her eye on the target, how to lead a moving object. He had her practice until her shoulder was sore and her hands were steady. He was, she realized, an expert. He had not just been a hired gun. He had been a good one. The tension between them was no longer suspicion. It was something new, something that hummed in the air. It was in the grazing of their hands when he passed her a tool. It was in the long, loaded stares they shared over the dinner table. One afternoon, they were branding a new calf. It was hot, dusty work. The smell of burnt hair and sweat filled the air. Clara wrestled the calf to the ground, holding it steady with her knee. Jack came over with the hot iron from the fire. He knelt, his thigh pressing against hers. The heat from his body was as intense as the iron. He pressed the brand. The calf bawled. When he was done, he looked up. His face was inches from hers. They were both breathing hard, streaked with dirt. His gray eyes were dark, fixed on her mouth. She wanted to kiss him. The urge was so strong, so violent, it terrified her. She shoved the calf away and stood, wiping her hands on her trousers. "We're done," she said, her voice rough. She resisted. She fought the desire. She remembered the map. She remembered the lies. But the body remembers warmth. A week later, the main water line from the creek, the one that fed the trough, broke. It was a long, brutal day of digging in the mud, finding the break, and mending the pipe. They worked past sunset, finishing by lantern light. They were both soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and exhausted. They trudged back to the cabin. Clara didn't even bother to wash. She unlaced her boots, kicked them off, and grabbed the whiskey bottle. She poured 2 fingers into a tin cup and drank it down. The fire burned a path to her stomach. She poured another. Jack was by the fire, just watching her. She walked over and handed him the bottle. "You earned this." He took a long drink, straight from the bottle. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. They stood in silence, the firelight playing over their exhausted faces. "Thank you," she said, the words quiet. "For the pipe." "We needed water," he said. "No, thank you." She looked at him. The man who had lied to her, the man who had saved her horses, the man who had held her while she cried, the man who had given her his secrets. She was so tired of fighting. Clara took a step. She put her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the damp cloth of his shirt. Then, before her mind could scream a warning, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of loneliness, of pent-up grief and desire. It was all the storms, all the fences, all the years of being alone, poured into one raw, hungry act. He froze for a second, surprised. Then his hand came up, burying in her hair, and he kissed her back. It was a raw, desperate, emotional collision. His mouth was firm and tasted of whiskey. He pulled her against him, and she did not resist. He lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, her hands clutching his shoulders. He didn't carry her to the cot. He carried her to the barn, to the hayloft, the only place that felt real. He laid her down in the sweet-smelling hay, the lantern light casting golden shadows. They tore at each other's clothes, a frantic, fumbling need. This was not about love. It was about life. It was about 2 broken people reminding each other they were still alive. It was raw, and it was rough, and it was exactly what they both needed. After, they lay tangled in the hay, their breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, Clara began to weep. Not the quiet tears of grief, but the shuddering sobs of fear. "Clara!" Jack's voice was rough. He propped himself on an elbow. "I don't want to be used again," she whispered, turning her face away from him, ashamed. "Every man, they just want to they take the land, they take your body, they take your hope. Please, don't let this be another lie." He was quiet for a long time. He gently brushed the hay from her hair. He kissed her shoulder, a touch so tender it made her ache. "I didn't come here to take anything, Clara," he said, his voice thick. "Not anymore." Clara woke in the hayloft. The sun was streaming through the slats in the barn roof, painting stripes of gold across the hay. She was sore, her body aching from a day of hard labor and a night of raw passion. But she was not cold. Jack's arm was slung over her waist, his breathing deep and even in sleep. She lay still, watching the dust motes dance in the light. A small, unfamiliar feeling fluttered in her chest. It was hope. It had been so long since she had woken up next to another person, so long since she had allowed herself to feel anything but the sharp edges of grief and anger. Last night had been a breaking point, a flood of desperation. But this morning, in the quiet light, it felt like something else. It felt like a beginning. She looked at his face in repose. The hard lines around his mouth were softened. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by the peace of sleep. He was a man with a dark past, a man who had lied, but he was also the man who had stayed, who had revealed his own scars, who had held her with a tenderness she thought had vanished from the world. She didn't want to be used. And he had promised, slowly, carefully. She slid out from under his arm. He stirred, but didn't wake. She pulled on her clothes, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She felt a strange shyness, a vulnerability that was more frightening than any blizzard. She walked from the barn into the sharp morning air. The land looked different. The sky seemed bluer, the green of the pasture by the creek more vibrant. She took a deep breath, the air clean and cold. Maybe, she thought, just maybe, she didn't have to be alone anymore. She was pumping water at the trough, washing her face, when she heard the horse. It was coming fast from the east. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at her waist. It was not a threat. Not this time. It was Silas Croft, a young man from town who sometimes ran messages for the telegraph office. He looked winded. His horse lathered. "Miss Carter," he called out, pulling up. "This just came. From Cheyenne. It's for you." He handed her a brown envelope, marked with the stamp of a law firm. A cold dread began to seep into the warmth of the morning. "Thank you, Silas. Can I get you some water?" "No, ma'am. I've got 2 more stops to make. Good day." He spurred his horse and was gone in a cloud of dust. She stood frozen for a moment, the envelope heavy in her hand. Jack emerged from the barn, buttoning his shirt, his hair tousled from sleep. He saw her face and his smile faded. "What is it?" "From a lawyer in Cheyenne." Her hands were shaking. She broke the wax seal. The paper was thick. Official. She read the words, her blood turning to ice. "They're doing it," she whispered, the paper trembling. "They're taking me to court, the cattle syndicate. They're filing a claim against my deed. They say my father's original filing was improper. They're claiming I'm a squatter on my own land." Jack's face went pale. He looked ill. "A judge will see the truth," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Will he?" she said, her voice rising with a frantic edge. "A syndicate judge, a railroad judge. This isn't justice. Jack, it's a legal way to steal. It's a piece of paper that says they can send the sheriff. They can send guns." "Clara," he took a step toward her. "We have to fight this," she said, her mind racing. "We need a lawyer. We need money. We need—" She looked at him, her eyes pleading for an answer, for the strength he had shown her, and she saw the truth on his face. He was not looking at the letter. He was looking at the ground, his face a mask of guilt. "Jack," she whispered. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Clara, that map, the one you found. What about it?" she said, the dread coiling in her stomach. "I didn't just find my way here," he said, the words costing him. "The syndicate, they sent me. Ames, the railroad man. He works for them. They all work for them." The world, which had seemed so bright and new, went silent. The sound of the wind, the creek, the birds, it all vanished. There was only the ringing in her ears. "They hired me a month ago," he said, his voice a low, rough confession. "They wanted to know everything, your water, your defenses, your weaknesses. The map was for them. That's why I was here." She stared at him. The hope in her chest curdled, turning into a sickness so profound she felt her knees weaken. It was all a lie. The roof, the horse, the blizzard, the confession. Last night, all of it. A lie. "You knew," she breathed, the words barely audible. "You knew this was coming." "No, I swear, I didn't know about the legal claim. I just knew they wanted the land. Clara, I turned. After the blizzard, after you, I never sent the map. I was going to tell you." "When?" she screamed, the sound tearing from her. "When were you going to tell me? After you had what you wanted in the hay? After I was fool enough to trust you?" "It wasn't like that," he yelled back. Taking a step toward her, she slapped him. The sound was sharp, a crack in the still morning air. She had hit him with all the force of her betrayal, all the pain of her father, of Thomas, of her son, of every lie she had ever been told. His head snapped to the side. A red mark bloomed on his cheek. He turned back to her, his gray eyes filled with a pain that matched her own. He did not look angry. He looked broken, and that, somehow, was worse. "Get out," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage so cold it burned. "Clara, please, let me help. I can fight them. I know how they work. Help me, she laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. You are them. You are the snake in my house. You held me. You listened to me cry. You let me. You disgust me. It wasn't a lie, he said, his voice desperate. Last night was not a lie. What I told you in the storm, that was the truth. There is no truth in you. Jack McCrae, you're a hired gun. You just use different weapons. Sometimes it's a map. Sometimes it's your body. You found my weakness. You found the lonely, stupid woman and you used her. That is not true. Get out, she shrieked, pulling the pistol from her holster and aiming it at his chest. This time, her hand was perfectly steady. Get your horse and get off my land. If I ever see your face again, I will shoot you. I swear to God. Jack, I will kill you. He looked at the gun. He looked at her face. Her eyes filled with a hatred that was pure and absolute. He had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. He did not fight back. He did not argue. He just nodded, his face defeated. He walked to his horse, which was still saddled from the night before. He untied the reins, swung into the saddle, and rode out. He did not look back. Clara stood there, her arm shaking, until he was a small, dark speck on the horizon. Then her arm fell to her side. The pistol felt heavy as lead. She was alone again, but this was a new kind of alone. It was worse than the blizzard. It was worse than the starvation, because for one brief, shining moment, she had believed she wasn't. The betrayal hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a cold, brittle shell. She did not cry. She tore the legal document into a dozen pieces and threw them into the wind. I will not, she whispered to the empty plains. I will not be moved. The ranch was vulnerable, and the vultures knew it. 2 days later, they came, 4 men, riding under the syndicate brand. They didn't ride up to the cabin. They sat on their horses on the ridge, just watching her. It was a message. Clara was mending the fence, the same fence she had been mending when Ames arrived. She carried her rifle now, slung over her back. She ignored them, her movements deliberate, her jaw set. They stayed for an hour. Then they rode off. The next morning, her water trough was dry. She walked the line to the creek. They had been methodical. They had not just broken the pipe. They had torn out a 20-foot section of it, tossing the pieces into the thick scrub. It would take her a week to fix it alone. She hauled water in buckets from the creek, her back screaming, her hands raw. The cattle, lowing with thirst, drank. The horses, the garden. It was endless. The day after that, she found her milk cow, the one Jack had saved in the blizzard. She was lying by the creek, her body bloated, her eyes wide and staring. Poison. Clara sank to her knees. She had raised that cow from a calf. It was her last one. They had not just taken her milk. They had taken a companion. They were taking everything, piece by piece. They were doing exactly what Ames had threatened. Accidents, lost stock. She tried to keep working. She was fueled by a rage so pure it kept her upright. She worked from before sunup until after dark. She ate beans from a can, standing up. She slept in the rocking chair, the rifle on her lap. She was a fortress of one, waiting for the siege. She talked to herself, just to hear a voice. Fence needs mending. Wood needs chopping. That axle is split. The list grew. The work piled up, and she was just one woman. She was running out of time. She was running out of strength. She was down by the creek, trying to wedge a new section of pipe into place. When the world began to tilt, the sun, beating down on her, felt like a hammer. The sound of the water seemed to recede, replaced by a buzzing in her ears. She hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days. She hadn't slept more than an hour at a time. The grief, the betrayal, and the sheer, brutal exhaustion had finally caught up. She leaned against the muddy bank, her vision blurring. She remembered Jack's face, the way he had looked at her in the hayloft, the man who had promised not to take anything. Liar. She thought of her son, Samuel, the weight of him in her arms, the terrible rattling sound of his last breath. She collapsed, sliding down the bank. Her hand fell into the cool water of the creek. and then the world went black. He had never left. Jack had ridden 2 miles, just over the ridge, to the small, hidden box canyon where he had first camped. He couldn't leave her. He knew what was coming. He knew the syndicate. He knew their methods. He had watched from a distance, his guilt a physical sickness in his gut. He had seen the riders on the ridge. He had seen her hauling the water buckets. He cursed himself. He cursed his past. He cursed the lies that had ruined the one good thing he had ever found. He had been sent to find her weakness, and it was her heart, the one he had promised to earn, and then had broken. He was watching through his field glasses when he saw her stumble. He saw her brace herself against the bank. He saw her fall. He was on his horse in an instant, spurring the buckskin, flying across the pasture. He found her half in the water, her face pale as wax, her lips blue. She was breathing, but it was shallow. He touched her forehead. She was burning with fever. He swore, a low, vicious sound. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He had let this happen. He carried her back to the cabin. The door was unbarred. He kicked it open and laid her gently on the cot, the one they had shared. She was delirious, muttering, her eyes rolling beneath their lids. He worked with a desperate, focused energy. He pulled off her muddy, soaked boots and trousers, his movements impersonal, medical. He dressed her in one of her own nightgowns, his hands surprisingly gentle. He covered her with quilts. He ran to the creek, filled buckets with water, and brought them back. He built up the fire. He found a tin of willow bark tea in her supplies and brewed it, forcing the bitter liquid between her lips. He bathed her face, her neck, her wrists, with cool water, trying to bring the fever down. She fought him, even in her delirium. She was a fighter. "No," she muttered, trying to push his hand away. "Get out, liar! Get out!" "Hush, Clara," he said, his voice low and rough. "It's all right. I'm here. Just rest." "Liar!" The word was a broken sob. He tended to her for 2 days. He never left the cabin. He sat in the rocking chair, the same one she had sat in, and watched her. He slept on the floor by her bedside, waking at her slightest sound. He saw the ranch through her eyes, the worn tools, patched and mended, the neat stitches on her clothes, the small, carved wooden bird her father had likely made, sitting on the mantel. This was not just land. It was a life, built from remnants and scraps and sheer, stubborn will. On the second night, the fever was at its worst. She was thrashing, caught in a nightmare. "Samuel," she cried out, her voice sharp with a grief that tore at his soul. "No, no, baby, don't go. Please, it's so cold. Please, Sammy, breathe. Just breathe for me. One more time." She was sobbing, her hands reaching for something that wasn't there. Jack couldn't bear it. He sat on the edge of the cot. He took her restless hand in his. It was hot and dry. "He's gone?" She wept, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing. "I watched him die. He was so little. I watched him, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't." "I know," Jack whispered, his own throat tight. He held her hand, anchoring her. "I know. Clara, I'm here." She gripped his hand, her fingers locking with his, a drowning woman's grip. She cried in her sleep, and he held her hand until the fever broke, and the sky began to gray with dawn. When she woke, her mind was clear. The fever was gone, leaving her weak as a newborn. She saw him. He was asleep in the chair, his head slumped on his chest, his face etched with exhaustion. His hand was still holding hers. She pulled her hand away as if she had been burned. He woke instantly. His gray eyes met hers. The betrayal came rushing back, sharp and clean. "Get out," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Clara, you were sick. You had a fever." "I don't care. I want you gone." She tried to sit up, to push him away, but she had no strength. She fell back against the pillows, tears of frustration and weakness welling in her eyes. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I hate you. I know. You can hate me, but you're not fighting them alone. Not anymore. I don't want your help. You need it. She tried to push him again, her hands weakly batting at his chest. Get out! He caught her wrists, his grip firm but not painful. He held her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Clara, stop! Stop fighting me! Stop fighting everything! His face was close, his eyes intense. You don't have to do this alone. She stared at him, her body trembling. The fight drained out of her, replaced by the crushing weight of her loneliness. She had been fighting alone for so long. She didn't know any other way. You lied to me, she whispered. The last of her defense. I did, he said, his voice thick. And I will spend the rest of my life making it right, if you let me. But I am not leaving you. They will kill you. Clara, they will starve you out. And they will kill you. And they will take this land. I will not let that happen. Tears streamed down her face. He slowly, gently, brushed them away with his thumb. He leaned in. He did not kiss her with the desperate passion of the hayloft. He kissed her forehead, a touch as light as a prayer. Then he kissed her lips. It was slow. It was tender. It was a question. It was a promise. It held all the pain of their shared secrets, all the weariness of their broken lives. It was not a kiss of desire, but of need. When he pulled back, she was no longer fighting. You have to swear, she whispered, her hands gripping his shirt. No more lies. I don't care about your past, but you swear to me. Jack, no more lies. I swear. And you won't leave. I can't do this again. If you're going to go, go now. I'm not leaving, he said, his voice raw. He kissed her again, sealing the promise. I'm ready to fight with you, Clara, he said, his forehead resting against hers. This land is yours. I know that. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. But your heart, I'll earn. It took several days for Clara's strength to return. Jack nursed her with a quiet, patient efficiency. He cooked broth. He cleaned the cabin. He mended the broken water line, his work fast and solid. He slept on the floor by her cot, never asking for more, never demanding forgiveness. Clara watched him. Her trust was a fragile, brittle thing, like ice on the creek in early winter. She had sworn to make him leave, and now her life depended on him. The kiss had sealed a truce, but it had not healed the wound. On the fourth day, she was able to stand, her legs shaky. She looked at the pieces of the legal notice on her table, which Jack had gathered from the floor. We need a lawyer, she said, her voice stronger than it had been. We can't just ignore this. Jack stopped stacking firewood on the porch. He looked at her, his face grim. They own the town. Clara, the syndicate, the railroad, they're the same thing. The sheriff, the circuit judge, they're all on the payroll. Then we make them own it in the light, she said, her jaw setting. I will not be run off by a piece of paper and a poisoned cow. We ride in, we file my father's deed with the county clerk. We make them tell us no to our faces. He saw the iron in her eyes and he did not argue. He just nodded. All right, we ride in. The work of the next 2 days was different. They were not just mending the ranch, they were fortifying it. Jack showed her how to build a low wall of rocks and earth, running from the corner of the porch to the water trough. It was just high enough to kneel behind. A breastwork, he'd called it. In case they come while we're gone, she'd asked. In case they come when we're here, he'd replied. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the hired hand, or the liar, or even the lover. He was her partner. He was teaching her to fight a war, not just survive the elements. They rode into town on a cold, bright morning. The town was little more than one dusty street, bracketed by a church and a saloon, but it felt more hostile than any blizzard. People stopped sweeping their porches to watch them. The blacksmith paused, his hammer quiet. They were outcasts. Jack wore his gun belt, the one she had made him take off. It looked natural on him, a part of him. Clara wore her own pistol, strapped high on her hip. They went to the sheriff's office first. Sheriff Brody was a large man, his belly straining his tin star. He was cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "Sheriff," Clara said, walking in. Jack stood in the doorway, blocking the light, his hands loose. Brody looked up, annoyed. "Miss Carter." His eyes flicked to Jack. "McCrae, heard you were still around. You're attracting trouble." "I'm having trouble." "Sheriff," Clara said. She laid her father's original deed on the desk. Then she laid out the syndicate's legal notice. "I wanted to file this deed properly, and I want to report a crime. My water line was destroyed. My last cow was poisoned. 4 men threatened me from the ridge." Sheriff Brody did not look at the papers. He leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Wyoming is a hard place. Miss Carter, things happen. Cattle get sick. Pipes freeze. This wasn't the weather. And you know it. This was the syndicate." Brody sighed. He slowly put his knife down. "Let me give you some advice. You are a woman alone." He flicked his eyes to Jack again. "Mostly alone. You're sitting on land the railroad needs. That's progress. And progress always wins. This syndicate has a claim filed in Cheyenne. All legal and proper." "It's a false claim." That ain't for me to decide. It's for a judge to decide. And the syndicate, they've got the future on their side. You've got a patch of dirt in a dead man's paper." He leaned forward. "My advice? Take the money they offered. A woman can't win this fight. So you won't help us." Clara's voice was cold. "You won't even investigate the poisoning." "I'm helping you right now," Brody said, his voice hardening. He was looking at Jack now. "I'm telling you to stay quiet. Go home. Pack your things. Don't make this a shooting matter. McCrae, I know your name. I know what you are. Don't make me get involved." "It already is a shooting matter," Clara said. She picked up her deed. "I see. You work for them, too." She turned and walked out. Jack gave the sheriff one long, cold look before he followed. "What now?" Jack asked, his voice low as they stood on the boardwalk. "We need supplies, and I still want to file this deed. Even if he won't look at it, the clerk has to." The general store was tense. The owner sold them flour, salt, and cartridges, his hands shaking, refusing to meet their eyes. As they stepped back out, Clara saw Mr. Ames, the railroad man, walking into the Rusty Spur saloon. He was with 2 other men, rough-looking, wearing the syndicate brand. "Clara, let's go," Jack said, taking her arm. "No, I'm tired of being chased out. I need a drink of water, and they have it." She pulled her arm free and walked toward the saloon. Jack swore under his breath and followed her. The saloon went silent when they entered. The piano player stopped, his hands hovering over the keys. Every man at the bar, every gambler at the tables, turned to look. Clara walked straight to the bar. "Whiskey," she said to the bartender. "And one for him." The bartender looked nervously at Ames. Ames, sitting at a corner table, smirked. He raised his glass. "Well, look what the wind blew in. Miss Carter, have you come to your senses? I hear the syndicate is still offering $500. A generous price for that dry patch." "We're not here for you, Ames," Clara said, keeping her back to him. "Oh, I think you are," Ames said, his voice rising, playing to the room. "Still trying to hold on, or have you found a new way to pay your debts?" He stared pointedly at Jack. "I hear you're selling the land with your legs now. Miss Carter, is that right? McCrae, is she worth the trouble? Or is she as barren as her land?" The room was utterly still. Clara froze. The humiliation was a physical blow, hot and sharp. She felt the blood drain from her face. Jack did not say a word. He didn't turn. He just moved. He took 3 steps. Before Ames could react, Jack grabbed him by the throat, yanking him from his chair. He slammed him against the wall. "Apologize to the lady," Jack growled, his voice a low vibration of violence. The 2 syndicate riders at the table went for their gun. They never cleared the leather. Jack was not a brawler. He was a professional. He released Ames, who crumpled to the floor, gagging. He drew his pistol in a blur, spinning to face the 2 men. "Don't," he said. The men froze. their hands hovering over their holsters. The bar exploded. One of the men, brave or foolish, tried to draw. Jack didn't shoot. He lunged forward, hitting the man in the jaw with the barrel of his pistol. The man dropped. The other rider kicked a chair at Jack and dived behind a table. Clara had her own pistol out, aimed at the man behind the table. "Stay down!" she yelled. A brutal, chaotic fight erupted. Jack used the man he had pistol-whipped as a shield, shoving him into another rider who tried to join the fray. Glass shattered. A table overturned. It was not a long fight. It was fast. And it was ugly. In less than a minute, Jack had the first man unconscious on the floor. The second man, seeing Clara's steady aim and Jack's cold fury, raised his hands from behind the table. The saloon was a wreck. Ames was on the floor, coughing, his face purple. The door burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there, his shotgun in his hands. "McRae, that's enough! You're under arrest for assault!" Jack didn't lower his pistol. He grabbed Clara's hand. "We're leaving." "The hell you are!" Brody leveled the shotgun. "You'll have to shoot us." "Sheriff," Jack said, his voice calm. He and Clara began to back out of the saloon, their guns covering the room. "And you know what the paperwork will be like." Brody hesitated, his face red. He was one man. Jack and Clara were out the door. "The horses, run!" They sprinted, shots ringing out behind them. A bullet tore a splinter from the post beside Clara's head. They yanked their reins free, swung into their saddles, and spurred their horses hard, galloping out of town, low over the horses' necks. They didn't stop until they were deep in the Badlands, the town a faint smudge of dust behind them. They hid in the hills for 2 days. They found a small box canyon with a spring, a place Jack knew. They were fugitives now. They had fought the law, and the law was the syndicate. That night, they sat by a small, smokeless fire. Jack was tending a raw cut on his knuckles, his shirt torn. Clara was cleaning her rifle. "I'm sorry, Clara," Jack said quietly, staring into the flames. "I shouldn't have lost my temper. I made it worse. They'll have warrants out for us now, for assault, maybe attempted murder." Clara stopped her work. She looked at him. "You defended me. No one has ever done that." She looked down at her hands. "He was wrong." A long silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. "We could keep riding," Jack said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "We could head north, Montana Territory, or Oregon. I've got a little money saved. We could find a new place, a place where nobody knows us, a place without syndicates or barons." He looked at her, his gray eyes shadowed by the firelight. "A place where we can just start over, just us." Clara looked into the fire. The thought of it was a physical ache. Peace, no fighting, no legal notices, no poisoned cattle. Waking up in the morning without a rifle in her hand. Waking up with him. She felt the temptation pull at her. She was so tired. She shook her head. "I can't." "Why not?" he asked, his voice gentle. "There's nothing left for you there but a fight you can't win. They'll take the ranch anyway. Clara, they'll send 12 men next time. Or 100. We can't beat them." "I know." She picked up a small stone, weighing it in her hand. "When my father was killed, I hid in the root cellar. When Thomas was shot, I hid in the cabin. I've been hiding and running my whole life. This is the only place I've ever stood my ground. The only place I've ever fought back." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and fierce. "This land has graves," she whispered, her hand unconsciously touching the dirt. "My father's, Thomas's, my son's. Their blood is in this soil. If I run now, I'm letting them erase it. I'm letting them erase them. I'm letting Ames, and the sheriff, and all of them win. I am done running." "Jack." He studied her face for a long time. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the unwavering resolve in her eyes. She meant it. This was not a choice. It was a fact. He nodded slowly. "Then we fight." They returned to the ranch under the cover of night. The cabin was as they left it, quiet, violated by the memory of the town. "I have to leave," Jack said, as he checked the perimeter. Just for a day, maybe two. Clara's heart seized. Leave? Now? I have to gather allies, he said. There are men I know, drifters, men who worked for the syndicate and got cheated out of their pay. Men who hate the barons as much as we do. They aren't good men, Clara, but they're fighters. And they'll fight, if the cause is right. Or if they get a chance to shoot at syndicate men. She looked at him, her trust warring with her fear. Go, she said, her voice firm. I'll hold the ranch. But come back, Jack. I'll come back, he promised. While he was gone, Clara prepared. She did not just wait. She found her father's old rifle, tucked away in the rafters of the barn. It was a heavy .50 caliber Sharps, a buffalo gun. It kicked like a mule, but it could stop a man at half a mile. She cleaned it, oiled it, and gathered the heavy cartridges. She took a plank of wood from the broken fence line, with a bucket of axle grease. She painted 2 words, no trespassing. Then she added another line below it. Survivors will be prosecuted. She nailed it to the main gate. Jack returned 2 days later, just after dawn. He was not alone. He had 3 men with him. They were rough, quiet, and heavily armed. This is Jeb, Jack said, pointing to a tall, thin man with a scarred face. This is Tom, and this is Gus. Gus was older, with a gray beard and watchful eyes. He spat a stream of tobacco. Clara walked onto the porch, her Winchester in her hands. She looked them over. You know what you're riding into? Gus nodded. McCrae says you're fighting the syndicate, and that you're paying in hot meals, ammunition, and $50 a man when it's done. I am, Clara said. McCrae also says it's a chance to kill syndicate men, Jeb added, his voice a rasp. That's good enough for us. They set up a perimeter. They reinforced the rock wall. They boarded up the back window of the cabin, leaving only a small loophole for a rifle. They set up watch posts in the rocks above the creek and in the hayloft. The ranch had become a fort. They waited. The spring snows melted, turning the creek into a muddy rush. The air grew warmer. And then they came. The attack came at dawn. A rider came first, holding a white flag. It was not Ames. It was a hard-faced foreman she didn't recognize. Clara Carter, he yelled from 50 yards out. We have a legal writ of seizure. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises before we are forced to remove you. Clara stood on the porch, her father's Sharps rifle resting in the crook of her arm. You're trespassing, she yelled back. Read the sign. The foreman laughed. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, tore it up, and threw it on the ground. 1 hour. He wheeled his horse and rode back to the ridge. The hour was the longest of Clara's life. She was at the front window. Jack was beside her. Gus and Jeb were at the rock wall. Tom was in the barn. They'll come fast, Jack said, his voice calm. They'll expect us to run. Hold your fire until they cross the creek. They came. 8 men, riding hard, rifles out, fanned out in a line. They were not expecting a fight. They were expecting to overrun a single woman and a hired gun. They crossed the creek, splashing through the water. Now! Jack yelled. The first volley was a roar of gunfire. The ranch exploded. Jeb and Gus fired from the rock wall. A horse went down. A man screamed, clutching his shoulder. The attackers scattered, diving for cover in the rocks by the creek. The fight began. Bullets ripped into the cabin, splintering the log walls, shattering the last remaining window. The air filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Clara was at her window, the Winchester at her shoulder. Her hands were shaking. She aimed at a man hunkered behind a boulder, but she couldn't pull the trigger. He was just a man. Clara, the barn! To the right! Jack yelled, reloading. She saw him. One of the attackers, younger than the others, was zigzagging toward the barn, a torch in his hand. He was going to fire her hay, her home. She saw her father, lying by the trough. She saw her poisoned cow. She saw Ames, sneering in the saloon. She rested the barrel of the Winchester on the windowsill. She remembered Jack's words. Breathe out. Squeeze. She aimed. She fired. The man stopped. He looked down at his chest, a look of strange surprise on his face. He dropped the torch. He crumpled to the ground. The fight stalled. The attackers, seeing two of their men down and the defense far stronger than they expected, began to pull back. They grabbed their wounded man and retreated, firing as they went, until they were over the ridge. Silence fell, absolute and deafening. It was over. Clara lowered the rifle. She was in a daze. She walked out from the cabin, onto the porch. Gus was nursing a graze on his arm, but they were otherwise untouched. She walked, her boots heavy, across the yard. She walked to the man she had shot. He was dead. His eyes were open to the blue sky. He couldn't have been more than 20. She backed away, stumbling. She leaned against the water trough, the one Jack had repaired, and was violently sick. The sobs came, tearing out of her. They were not the sobs of grief, but of a terrible, hollow shock. "I killed him," she whispered, her hands shaking. "Oh, God, I killed him." Jack was there. He didn't say it was all right. He didn't say the man deserved it. He just wrapped his arms around her, holding her upright as she shivered, his own face grim. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice rough. "You're just surviving. That's all. You're just surviving." They buried the man on the hill, not with her family. Near the boundary line, a warning. That night, Jack held her on the cot. She did not cry. She was silent, staring into the darkness. The image of the man's open eyes burned into her mind. "I won't let it happen again. Clara," Jack whispered, his voice raw. "I won't let them make you do that again. From now on, I take the risks. I swear it. I'll stand in front of you." She didn't answer. She just turned and held him tighter, her face buried in his chest. The war had begun, and she had fired the first shot. The victory, if it could be called that, lasted 4 days. A heavy, armed silence settled over the ranch. Jack, Clara, and the 3 hired men worked in shifts, reinforcing the rock wall, sleeping with rifles by their beds. The syndicate did not return. "They're spooked," Gus said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "They figured on a farm girl, not a fort." Jack shook his head, his eyes on the ridge line. "No, they're not spooked. They're planning." He was right. The attack came not with guns, but with fire. It was the middle of the night. Clara was on watch in the barn loft, the air still and cold. She smelled it first. Not the sweet smell of hay, but the sharp, acrid smell of kerosene and smoke. She looked down through a gap in the floorboards, a flicker of orange. "Jack!" she screamed, her voice tearing the night. "Fire! The barn!" She scrambled down the ladder just as Jack burst in from the cabin, his pistol in his hand. The small flicker had already become a roar. The dry hay, their entire winter's feed, was going up in a sheet of flame. "They came from the back!" Jeb yelled from outside. "They set it and ran!" It was chaos. The horses screamed in terror, kicking at their stalls. "Get the horses!" Jack bellowed, grabbing a bucket. "Tom, Gus, the well! Clara, get the horses out, now!" Clara ran toward the stalls, the smoke burning her lungs, the heat scorching her face. She yanked open the latch on Daisy's stall, hitting the terrified mare to make her move. "Go! Get out!" They tried to fight it. They formed a bucket brigade from the trough, but it was useless. The fire was too hot, too fast. The hay was fuel. The barn, her father's barn, was an inferno. They stood, helpless, coughing in the smoke, and watched it burn. They saved the horses, the saddles, and 2 blankets. Everything else was gone. The hay, the tools, the building that had stood for 20 years. Clara sank to her knees, the heat on her face, the roar of the fire in her ears. Jack put his hand on her shoulder. "They're still out there," he said, his voice low, pulling her toward the meager protection of the cabin. They waited until dawn, the rifle loopholes manned, but the syndicate men were gone. They had done their work. When the sun rose, it illuminated the smoking, blackened skeleton of the barn. The hay was a mountain of gray ash. "That's it then," Gus said, his voice flat. He looked at the ruin. They ain't gonna fight us. They're just gonna pick us apart. There's no feed for winter. This ranch is done." Clara said nothing. She was numb. "We found this," Jeb said, his voice grim. He and Tom were walking from the creek pasture. Clara looked. They were dragging something. It was her last cow, the calf of the one that had been poisoned. It had been shot, once, through the head. Not for meat, just to be thorough. Clara looked at the dead calf. She looked at the smoking ruins of her barn. She looked at her hands, black with soot. She broke. It was not the sob of the woman who had lost her child. It was the dry, racking gasp of a soul that had run out of strength. "They'll starve us out," she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. She fell, sitting hard in the dirt, the pistol still at her hip. Useless. "They'll just wait. They'll wait until the snow comes, and we're eating the horses, and then they'll come. They've won." Jack looked at her, his heart breaking. He saw the woman from the blizzard, the woman who had survived starvation, the woman who had killed a man to protect her home, finally, utterly defeated. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the other men. He put his hands on her shoulders. "Clara, listen to me. We're leaving." She shook her head, her eyes vacant. "I'm not running. I told you, this land has graves." "This land will have our graves if we stay," he said, his voice fierce, trying to reach her. "This isn't a fight anymore. It's an execution. I am not letting you die for a patch of dirt and a pile of ash. It's my home. It's a graveyard." He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. "I'll leave with you. We'll go to Montana. We'll go anywhere. But we are leaving." She just shook her head, the fight gone, replaced by a terrible, stubborn emptiness. "No, I'll die here." Jack looked at her, at the absolute surrender in her eyes. He had to save her from her own strength. He did the only thing he could. He fell to his knees in the ash. He, Jack McCrae, the man who had never begged, put his hands on her knees and lowered his head. "Please, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. "Not for me, for you. I am begging you. Let this go. I am not asking you to be weak. I am asking you to live. You deserve to live. You deserve to see a sunrise without a rifle in your hand. Please, come with me. Choose to live." The other men turned, giving them their privacy. Clara looked down at the man kneeling in front of her. He was not begging her to save him. He was begging her to save herself. He was offering her life, not a fight. She saw the man who had held her hand through the fever, the man who had defended her honor in the saloon, the man who was now, finally, brought lower than she was. She had held on to the land because it was the only thing that had not betrayed her. Now, a man was offering her a truth just as solid. Tears, hot and clean, washed trails in the soot on her face. "Yes," she whispered. "All right, Jack, we'll go." He paid the 3 men. He gave them half of what he had, almost $100. "The fight's over," he told them. "We're riding out. You're free of your contract. Take a horse each. You earned it." Gus looked at Clara, then at Jack. "Where will you go?" "North, where they can't find us," Jack said. Gus nodded. "Good luck, McCrae. You'll need it." They rode away, leading the spare horses. Clara and Jack were alone. They packed what little they had left. 2 horses, 1 pack mule, food for a week, 2 rifles, their pistols, the tin type of Thomas and Samuel. Clara stood by the graves on the hill. She touched the wooden cross of her father. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I can't stay." She did not look back as they rode north, into the high country, toward the mountains. They fled into the wilderness. Jack led them on trails she never knew existed, old trapper paths that wound high into the Wind River Range. They were no longer ranchers. They were fugitives. The world shrank. Their universe was the sound of the horses' hooves on stone, the smell of pine, the bite of the high-altitude wind. They spoke little. They just moved. Their love, born in desperation and sealed in violence, now deepened into something else. It became survival. He taught her how to set a snare, and she caught a rabbit. which they cooked over a tiny fire that Jack built in a rock crevice so the smoke would not be seen. She showed him how to use herbs she found to make a poultice for his horse, which had scraped its leg on a rock slide. They camped under the stars, huddling together for warmth as the temperature dropped below freezing. They found shelter in old, abandoned trapper cabins, little more than three-sided lean-tos. He would wake in the night to find her watching the darkness, her hand on her pistol. He would take the pistol from her grasp, kiss her fingers, and hold her until she slept. She watched him. He was a different man in the wild. He was at home. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace. He saw everything. A broken twig, a distant hawk, the way the clouds were forming. He was protecting her, and in his protection, she found a strange, terrifying peace. One night, they were camped in a shallow cave, a bitter wind howling outside. They had shared the last of their rabbit stew. They were cold. They were tired. And they were, for the first time, completely safe. Clara was staring into the embers of the fire. She was quiet. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, his voice a low rumble beside her. She was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice flat, emotionless. "When my father died, I was in the cellar. I listened to him die. When Thomas died, I was angry. I hated the Harrisons. I hated the land. When Samuel died," she paused, her body tensing. "When my son died, I felt nothing. I was just empty. I sat in that chair, and I held him for a full day after he was gone. I just held him. I couldn't feel anything. I thought I was broken." She turned to him in the dark, her eyes wide, haunted. "Every man who has ever touched me, Jack, wanted something. My father wanted a son to work the land. Thomas wanted a wife to build a home. Ames wanted my body. The syndicate wanted my water. They all wanted to break me or bury me. They all took something. My father, Thomas, my son, they're all in the ground. I'm the only one left." She was shivering, but not from the cold. "I let you touch me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And I'm just waiting. Jack, I'm just waiting to see what you'll take, what you'll break." He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He gently reached out and took her hand, which was calloused, scarred from barbed wire, raw from hauling water. He brought it to his lips. He kissed the scars, one by one. He kissed the calloused palm. He kissed the raw knuckles. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "I don't want to break you, Clara," he said, his voice thick. "I don't want your land. I don't want your strength. I don't want your past." He pulled back, holding her face, his thumbs brushing the tear tracks she didn't know were there. "I just want you breathing beside me tomorrow. That's all. I just want you to be alive and to be whole." She looked at him. She saw his gray eyes, clear and steady in the firelight. He was not lying. He was not taking. He was giving. He was offering her the one thing she had never had, a tomorrow that was not a fight. She had said she would not be moved. She had held her ground. But now, in this cave, she finally, truly, let go. "Jack," she whispered, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. "I'm here. I love you." The words were quiet, but they echoed in the small space, more powerful than any gunshot. She was not saying them in passion or in desperation. She was saying them as a fact, a truth. It was the ultimate act of trust. He closed his eyes, a tremor running through him. He kissed her, deeply, slowly. It was not the kiss of the hayloft, or the kiss by the sick bed. It was a kiss of acceptance, a kiss that said he understood. They did not stay in the mountains. They could not. Winter was coming, and they were survivors, not hermits. The truce with their past was over. They had to face the future. "What do we do?" she asked him. 2 days later, as they looked down from the high pass onto the plains. "We fight," he said, "but not with guns. Not yet. We fight with the truth." "The truth? I know a man in town, a lawyer, Elias Abernathy. He's old, and he drinks. But he's one of the only men there who knew your father. And he hates the syndicate. He just hates them less than he fears them. I think he knows something. I think he knows why their claim is so strong. They snuck back into town under the cover of a new moon. It was past midnight. The street, a river of dark, empty shadows. They left their horses in a gully outside of town and moved on foot, like ghosts. Abernathy's office was dark, above the general store. Jack picked the lock on the back door, his movements sure and practiced. They found him asleep at his desk, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow, the room smelling of stale paper and regret. "Abernathy," Jack said, his voice low. The old man started, knocking his chair over, his eyes wide with terror. "Who's there? I've got a gun!" Jack lit a match, the sudden light illuminating his hard face. "You won't use it. Elias, McCrae, they said you were gone. They said you ran. We're back." Clara stepped out of the shadow. Abernathy's gaze softened. "Miss Carter, Clara, my God, child, what have you done? You're wanted for assault. The whole town is looking for you." "We know what the syndicate did." "Elias," Clara said, her voice steady. "The fire, the cattle. We're not running anymore." "You can't win," the old man whispered, sinking back into his chair. "They own everything." "They don't own the truth," Jack said. He put his hands on the desk. "Their legal claim, it's too clean. How did they get it? How did they challenge a deed that's been good for 20 years? Abernathy looked away. "I don't know. Don't lie to me." "Elias," Jack said, his voice dropping. "All the ice of the mountain wind in it. I've killed men for less. You knew her father. You drank with him. Now they're burning his legacy. And you're sitting here drowning in your own cowardice. Tell her. Tell her how they did it." The old man began to tremble. He looked at Clara, his eyes filling with shame. "The ledger," he whispered. "The old county ledger. From 1860. Your father's claim is in it, clear as day." "So the claim is legal," Clara said. "It was," Abernathy said. He reached under his desk, fumbling with a key. He opened a floor safe, hidden under a rug. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. "Harding, the head of the syndicate. He came to me a month ago. He knew I kept the old books. The courthouse ones are copies. He paid me $500. He paid me to tear out the page." He opened the book. A ragged edge showed where page 51 should have been. "Your father's claim is gone," Abernathy said, his voice breaking. "Legally, it doesn't exist. The claim they filed is on open land." Clara stared at the book. The proof, the whole war, the deaths, the fire, all over a torn piece of paper. Jack looked at the lawyer, his face carved from stone. "Does Harding have the page?" "No, he wanted me to burn it, but I couldn't. Silas was a good man." He fumbled in his desk drawer, pulling out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "It's here." Clara took it. Her father's name, his signature, the stamp of the Wyoming Territory. "Then we have them," Jack said. He left Clara in the office, the door locked. "Stay here. Don't open it for anyone." He walked across the street to the hotel. The night clerk was asleep. Jack walked up the stairs to the best room. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open. Elias Harding, the syndicate leader, was in bed. He sat up, reaching for the gun on his nightstand. Jack's pistol was at his forehead before he could touch it. "McCrae," Harding's voice was calm, but his eyes were wide. "We found the ledger page." "Harding," Jack said, his voice a dead, cold whisper. Harding's face paled. "We have the proof, the fire, the poisoned cattle, the forgery." "That's enough to get you hung." "What do you want?" Harding asked, his composure returning. "Money? I can pay. I want you to call off your dogs." Jack said. "You will drop the claim. You will leave her alone. Forever." "Or what?" Harding sneered. "You'll go to Sheriff Brody? He works for me." "No," Jack said. He pressed the barrel of the pistol harder against Harding's skin. "I'm not going to the sheriff. I'm not going to a judge. If you or any of your men come near her ranch again, if you even look at her crooked, I will come back, and I will put a bullet in your brain." He leaned closer. You can't buy me. You can't threaten me. I'm not a rancher. I'm the man who slaughtered your men in Texas. You know my reputation. Test me, and you'll die on her soil." He held the man's gaze for a full 10 seconds. Then he pulled back, holstered his pistol, and walked out of the room. The town began to shift. Abernathy, his courage returned by whiskey and shame, started talking. He told the blacksmith. He told the store owner. He showed them the ledger. The story spread. The quiet, respectable townsfolk, who had looked the other way, were suddenly faced with a truth they couldn't ignore. This wasn't progress. It was a criminal conspiracy. When Clara and Jack walked to the general store the next morning, in broad daylight, the store owner met them on the porch. "Miss Carter," he said, his face grim. He handed her a box. "Flour, bacon, cartridges. It's on the house. What Harding did, it was wrong." The blacksmith came over. "That writ Brody has, it's based on a lie. He can't enforce it. Not now. The whole town knows." The tide was turning. "It's not enough," Abernathy said. Meeting them by their horses, he was sober. "Harding is scared, but he won't stay scared. He'll just go to Cheyenne and buy a bigger judge. The local court is useless. You have to go federal." "Cheyenne," Clara said. "That's 100 miles. There's a federal judge, Judge Wright. He's a hard man, but he's an honest one. He's the only one who can make this stick. You take him the ledger, you take him the page, you tell him your story. It's your only chance." Clara looked at Jack. It was a risk. They would be targets every step of the way. Harding would not let that ledger page get to Cheyenne. Jack nodded, his hand resting on his pistol. "We'll ride today." "I'm coming with you," Abernathy said, surprising them all. "I'm the only one who can testify to the forgery. I started this. I'll finish it." Clara looked at the beaten-down lawyer, seeing a new strength in his eyes. She looked at the store owner, who was loading another bag onto their pack mule. She was not alone. For the first time, she was not alone. They risked it all. The ride to Cheyenne was over 100 miles of open, hostile country. They rode fast, pushing the horses, with the old lawyer Abernathy struggling to keep up. Jack led. Clara rode in the middle, and Abernathy, clutching the satchel that held the ledger and the precious, torn page, brought up the rear. They were not just travelers. They were a target. Every ridgeline, every dry wash, every stand of cottonwood was a potential ambush. Harding would not let that ledger page reach the federal court. Jack did not follow the main road. He cut east, through a landscape of barren buttes and deep ravines that offered cover, but also offered a dozen places for men to lie in wait. Clara rode with her Winchester in her saddle scabbard, her hand rarely straying from the pistol at her hip. She had killed a man. The shock had faded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She would do it again to protect what was hers. "We're being watched," Jack said on the second day. He spoke to the air, his eyes scanning a high ridge to their left. Clara saw nothing. "How do you know?" "The hawks," he said, his voice low. "They've been disturbed, risen twice from the same spot. They're following us." Abernathy, his face pale and sweating under his hat, looked nervously at the ridge. "Harding's men?" "Assume it," Jack said. He urged his horse into a faster trot. "We'll push on, try to make the Sweetwater crossing by nightfall. They won't want to attack in the open." But they misjudged the terrain, and they misjudged the enemy's patience. The ambush came in a place Jack had hoped to avoid, a narrow canyon where the trail squeezed between high, red rock walls. The first shot was a high-pitched whine, a bullet striking sparks from the rock just inches from Clara's head. "Down!" Jack roared. He was off his horse in an instant, dragging Abernathy from his saddle. The lawyer fell heavily, the satchel flying from his grasp. Clara leaped from Daisy, her rifle in her hand, scrambling behind the meager cover of a fallen log. 4 men perched on the canyon rim above them. "Open fire!" Bullets chewed the dust around them. A deafening crack and echo. Their horses screamed, panicked, and bolted, taking their supplies with them. "The ledger!" Abernathy cried, crawling toward the satchel, which lay exposed in the middle of the trail. "Stay down, you old fool!" Jack yelled. He fired twice, 3 times, at the rim. The shots precise, aimed to suppress, not to kill. One of the ambushers stood, trying to get a clear shot at the lawyer. "Clara!" Jack yelled. Clara didn't hesitate. She remembered Jack's lesson. Breathe out, squeeze. She fired the Winchester. The man on the rim spun, clutched his arm, and fell back, disappearing. "I got him! You just made them angry," Jack shouted. He grabbed a handful of dust, looked at the wind. "They've got us pinned. We have to move. We can't leave the book," Abernathy insisted, his face a mask of terror and a strange, new-found courage. He made another lunge for it. A bullet struck the satchel, kicking it into the air. "No!" Clara saw Jack's face change. The calm, focused fighter was gone, replaced by a cold fury. "Cover me," he ordered. He broke from his cover, running low, a zigzag pattern, just as she had seen the young man with the torch do. He scooped up the satchel, his other hand firing his pistol up at the rim. He made it back, diving behind the rock, just as a volley of shots tore up the ground where he had been. "They're coming down!" Jack yelled, reloading. "Both sides!" They were trapped. 2 men and 1 woman who had fired a rifle twice in her life, against 4 hired guns. But the attackers, confident in their high ground, made a mistake. They split up, 2 coming down the goat path in front, 2 circling behind. "You take the front," Jack said to Clara, his voice steady. "Don't let them get close. Abernathy, you stay behind this rock and you don't move. Understand?" The fight was fast, brutal, and close. Clara, her fear replaced by a cold focus, fired as the 2 men descended, keeping them pinned behind the rocks. Then, from behind, she heard a scuffle and a grunt. She spun. One of the men had circled, finding a way down. He was on Jack, a knife in his hand. They were rolling in the dust. A desperate, silent struggle. Clara aimed her pistol. She couldn't get a clear shot. The 4th man appeared, running toward Abernathy. The old lawyer, his eyes wide, swung the heavy ledger satchel like a club, connecting with the man's knees. The man howled, falling, and Abernathy dropped a rock on his head. Jack grunted. The man he was fighting had the knife, raising it for a final blow. Clara screamed, fired her pistol, and missed. Jack, in a final surge, twisted, got his hand on the man's wrist, and slammed it, again and again, against a sharp rock. The man screamed. Jack got the knife. It was over in one swift, terrible motion. Silence. The canyon was still. Clara was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Jack rose, his shirt soaked in blood. "Are you hit?" she cried, running to him. "Not mine," he said, his voice rough. He looked at the man at his feet. Then he looked at Abernathy, who was sitting, stunned, over the unconscious man he had felled. "You all right, Elias?" Jack asked. Abernathy looked at his hands, then at the man. I believe I am. Mr. McCrae." They took the attackers' horses. They left the 2 dead men where they lay and tied the other 2 up, leaving them for the buzzards or the sheriff, whichever came first. They rode on. The rest of the journey was in grim silence. They were no longer just victims. They were survivors. Cheyenne was a shock. It was a city, loud with the clang of industry, the rumble of locomotives, the shouts of men. It was full of suits and money and power. Clara, in her trail-dusted trousers, her hair matted, felt smaller and poorer than she ever had on her ranch. The federal courthouse was an imposing brick building, a symbol of a power she had never trusted. They found Harding already there. He was not under arrest. He was sitting with 3 expensive-looking lawyers, laughing, confident. He saw Clara, Jack, and Abernathy enter, and his smile widened. He looked at them like dirt. "Judge Wright will see you now," a bailiff called. The courtroom was vast, all dark wood and high ceilings. Judge Wright was an old man with a face like carved granite and eyes that seemed to see everything. Harding's lawyer spoke first. He was smooth, elegant. He painted Clara as a delusional, violent squatter. He spoke of progress, of the railroad, of the legal claim his client had filed on open, unclaimed land. He presented the new county ledger, the one with the empty space. Then it was Abernathy's turn. The old lawyer, in his rumpled suit, his hands shaking, was a different man. He was not the town drunk. He was an officer of the court. He presented the old ledger. He presented the torn, folded page. "And you, sir?" the judge asked, his voice a low boom. "You were the county clerk, and you willfully and feloniously conspired to forge a legal document in exchange for a bribe." "I was, and I did," Abernathy said, his voice clear. "I was a coward. I took the money, but I could not destroy the truth, and I'm here to undo the lie I helped create." Harding's lawyers were on their feet, shouting. The judge silenced them with a look. "Miss Carter," the judge said. Clara was sworn in. She stood, her hands gripped together. She looked at Harding. She looked at the judge. She looked at Jack, who stood against the back wall, his face calm, his eyes locked on hers. He gave her a single, slow nod. She began to speak. She told them everything. She did not just present facts. She gave them her life. She told them about her father, Silas, killed by raiders, his blood soaking the land he had filed for. She told them about Thomas, her fiancé, shot in the back over a boundary dispute. "They are buried there, Your Honor," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying in the still room. And then her voice broke. She told them about Samuel, about her baby, about the fever, about burying her child in the frozen ground with her own hands. "They say I am a squatter," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now, but she did not wipe them. "They say that land is empty. That land is not empty. It holds everyone I have ever loved." She told them about the syndicate, about Ames, about the threats, about the poisoned cattle, about the fire that destroyed her barn, her livelihood. She told them about the ambush in the canyon, and she told them about the shootout. "Yes, I killed a man," she said, her voice rising. "He was coming to burn what was left of my home. They sent him. He died. He died trying to take the last thing I had. They call me a criminal. I call it surviving." She was crying, but she was not weak. She was a pillar of fire. "They sit here in their fine suits, and they talk about progress. Their progress is built on forgeries, and fire, and poison, and graves. My father's grave, my son's grave. All I have is that land. All I am is that land, and I will not be moved," she finished. The courtroom was so silent. She could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Judge Wright looked at her for a long time. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Harding, whose face was no longer smiling. "This court," the judge said, his voice ringing with quiet fury, "is not a tool for thieves. Mr. Harding, your claim is not only denied, it is fraudulent. I am stripping you of this claim, and of any other claims you hold in that county, pending a full federal investigation, which I am opening today." He looked at Clara. "Miss Carter, your deed, as filed by your father, Silas Carter, is declared valid, legal, and binding. The land is yours." He banged the gavel. Harding's lawyers were speechless. Harding himself looked apoplectic. Clara just stood there, swaying, the world tilting. Jack was there. His arm was around her waist, holding her up. She buried her face in his chest. And for the first time, she cried, not in grief or in rage, but in relief. It was over. The ride home was quiet. Abernathy had stayed in Cheyenne, giving a full and quite drunken statement to the federal marshals. Clara and Jack rode side by side. They were not fugitives. They were just two people, riding home. When they crested the ridge, the one where Ames had first given his warning, Clara pulled her horse to a stop. The ranch was scarred. The barn was a blackened skeleton. The cabin had bullet marks pocking the logs. The land was quiet, peaceful, and theirs. She dismounted, walked a few feet, and knelt. She picked up a handful of the dirt her father had bled on, the dirt she had fought for. She let it run through her fingers. Jack watched her. He did not say a word. They had been back for a day, clearing the wreckage. When the wagons arrived, it was the blacksmith and the store owner, and even Sheriff Brody, looking deeply ashamed. They brought lumber. They brought bags of seed, sacks of flour, tools, and 2 new milk cows. "Miss Carter," the blacksmith said, tipping his hat. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a new respect. "The town, we wanted to help you rebuild." Brody stepped forward, holding his hat in his hands. "Ma'am, what Harding did, and what I let him do, it was wrong. I'm here to tell you that you'll have no more trouble from the law. You have my word." Clara looked at the men, at the supplies. She was not alone. The town, which had shunned her, was finally and truly on her side. That evening, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cool. Clara was standing by the ruins of the barn, her hand on the one charred post that still stood. It was the spot where Jack had pressed her to the wall, the place where the war had truly begun. He came to stand beside her. They watched the sun dip behind the mountains. "We'll need to rebuild before the snow," she said, her voice practical, tired. "We will," he said. He was quiet for a long time. She turned to look at him. His face was soft in the fading light, his gray eyes full of something she was just beginning to understand. "Clara," he said, his voice low. He took her hand, the calloused, scarred hand he had kissed in the cave. "This land, it's yours. You've earned it, 10 times over." He knelt, not with the desperation of the man in the ashes, but with a quiet, solid reverence. He knelt in the dirt, by the ruin of her past. "I'm not a man who has a lot to offer," he said, his voice rough. "I've got a fast horse, a good gun, and a bad name, but I love you. I love your strength, and I love your scars, and I will spend every day I have left trying to be a man who deserves to be near them." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "I don't want to own you. I don't want to break you or fix you. I just want to walk beside you, to build with you. Will you marry me?" "Clara Carter?" She looked down at the man who had seen her at her worst, who had held her, fought for her, and lied to her. The man who had come to take her land and had ended up giving her back her life. Tears welled, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jack, I will." He stood, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, or of desperation, or of promise. It was a kiss of arrival. The final scene was a quiet morning. Weeks later, the new barn was framed, the lumber raw and yellow against the landscape. Clara stood on the porch, barefoot, the rough wood cool beneath her feet. She was wearing Jack's shirt, the sleeves rolled up. She was watching the sunrise, a cup of coffee steaming in her hand. The land was green, healing. She heard the cabin door open. He came out, wrapping his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder. They fit. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the day be born. "You have my heart, Jack McCrae," she said, her voice soft. She leaned her head back against him. "You do. But this land still comes first." He smiled. He kissed the top of her head. "Then I'll build our life on it. 2 broken people, now whole, standing on land no one can take, together." Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. If you enjoyed this, please be sure to subscribe to From Wild West and share your feelings about the story in English.